I'll begin by asking you to create a picture in your mind. And if I say the term medieval Europe, what picture comes into your mind? If it may well be some variant of the famous Duc de Berry illustrations, the French illustrations from around 1400, which are very colorful, and they're in different seasons, and each one depicts peasants toiling in the fields, and in the back is a castle. That is, I think, a pretty good depiction of Europe in the Middle Ages, European politics, the political structure, and the economic structure that held sway. Typically, somewhere far in the distance, you had a king and you had the church, and those were the ultimate authorities. But locally, you had a boss, you had a nobleman who often lived in a castle and who controlled land. And people lived on that land, and they worked the land, and they worked for the nobleman. They were under his protection. He protected them if they needed it. And they were his workers. But yet they would pay rent to him in the form of either their labor or their crops. Often they would not go through their lives without having coins in their pocket, let alone without a bank account. So it was a very different kind of economy from what we're used to, and it existed because of this relationship to the land. And when you had this when you were locked into this system, you were kind of locked. You were in a certain place, and that you probably were not going to change your position very dramatically, and that has, I think, an effect on your sensibility. You don't even think about the possibility of changing your position. That picture did not fit the far northwest windswept corner of Europe called the Dutch provinces. The people who settled there in the Middle Ages, there were some places that had been settled as far back as the Roman period, but people who settled that in the 1100s and 1200s set up something, because they had to, it set up quite differently. So a group of people, maybe not quite this many people, but a group of people would get together who all lived in the same area, and they were struggling with a certain kind of problem, a common joint problem. And that was that every year the coastline shifted. Where they were living was a place where 3 of Europe's rivers come to the sea. So it was a vast river delta. It was impossible to plan ahead. Things would be underwater, things would be swamp, things would be marsh. And so the people would get together and they would decide as individuals, as a group of individuals, that they would go through the enormously arduous work of creating dikes, creating these earthen borders built up around a perimeter, around an area. And it doesn't have to be very big. If you ever travel in the Netherlands, if you've ever traveled on a road from one city to another in the Netherlands, often you are traveling on a dike. The road is on top of one of these earthen structures, and it just slopes down gently. And so having built the dikes, they then do another round of arduous work, which is to cut trenches, cut ditches down. And what that does is the soil is very marshy, and it allows the water to drain down into these trenches. And then if you have mills, you can help to get the water away. So we've done that. This group of people has decided to do this together, and here is this land now. That land is not owned by a nobleman, it's not owned by a church, it's not owned by a king, it's ours. We created it. There's a famous Dutch saying, God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland. And this is what they mean. We've created this, and what the people in these different communities decided next was to apportion it. Everybody would become an owner of a certain piece of it. And maybe one person decides he doesn't really need it, so he'll sell his lot to his neighbor. And maybe someone else decides, I might need mine in the future, but I don't need it right now, so I'll rent it to you. So they started buying and selling and renting the land. So they set up a kind of proto-modern economy this way. This then has a certain effect, I think, over time on the culture, on the individual sensibility, because it empowers the individual. If you can do this kind of thing, if you can expand who you are, so to speak, economically, you start to think that you can expand in other ways. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this is, and it's not fully appreciated, is, so this creates this group of empowered individuals, but it was a collective, it was a community that allowed this individual empowerment. And once these individuals have this extra sense of themselves, what they would do is go back together as a group of now stronger individuals and decide collectively to do other things. So what you see throughout Dutch history is this interplay between the individual and the collective. And the Dutch have a term that encompasses part of this. A polder is an area of land that was reclaimed from the sea. And the polder model is something that the Dutch use to talk about their way of decision making, their way of like, well, we'll get together, we'll decide, we'll hash problems out like this. So this is how the country, this is before, it isn't even a country, it's a collection of provinces, and they develop this way. Developing this way gives them a certain approach to risk-taking, to innovation, to a way of looking at the future as something that individual AI can have an effect on. This comes out then in all sorts of ways. There are all kinds of examples. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of how this develops. In the 1500s, before that, in that part of the world, one of the most valued commodities was herring. The herring industry, and everybody fished for herring in that part of the world. Scandinavians did. And what you would do is you would go not very far from the shore and you would gather the herring and you would bring them back and you would cut them open, you would clean them and you pack them in a light brine, and then you would hurry up and get them to market because it's a perishable commodity. I mean, it's packed lightly in brine, but it's going to go bad soon. So somebody discovered, probably by accident, that if you leave a piece of the stomach in with the fish when it's in the solution, it will stay good far longer. And as a byproduct, it improves the flavor. So they realized that doing this meant you could technically go further out to sea and get more herring. The next innovation this group of Dutch herring merchants undertook was to create vessels that could do that. And so the Dutch city of Hoorn, they developed this vessel, and sort of Amsterdam kind of appropriated it because it tends to appropriate things from other parts of the Netherlands. And it was this kind of a stout, deep ship called a herring bus that could go far out into the North Sea. And they had teams working on it, and it was kind of a factory, a floating factory. So the teams working on it the fishermen would fish, and the others would cut them open, and they would process them, and they would pack them into barrels and seal them, and they would seal them Amsterdam herring, Dutch herring. So they actually were literally branding as well. So they cornered the market on this product. This was one of the things that led to the rise of the Dutch Golden Age. Another is, another quick example of that, of sort of economic thing is, so you're expanding now, you have these shipping ports and you're expanding your shipping and transshipping, and you have these little companies that are doing this work. And as you go to a different port, you realize they've got some raw material here that's really cheap. So they would just buy it all and bring it back home and then figure out what to do with it. You know, they're thinking in a different way from the people who are kind of locked into that medieval painting that I sketched out. So they would bring the raw material back. So from Eastern Europe, they bring back the raw materials for soap. And so along the Amstel River in Amsterdam, all these soap factories spring up. And then they go one better. They decide that all Amsterdam soap will be colored green. And they did this for branding purposes. So in England and Italy at this time, people bought soap and they knew it was Amsterdam soap because it was green. So again, this is a very modern kind of thinking. These Dutch ports then, are functioning this way. And as with any port cities, they are, all different kinds of people are there. And all the people are also there from different places because it's the Low Countries. It's an easier place to get to in many respects than other places. And the Dutch developed from early on an approach to otherness, I guess you might say, toleration. There is a Dutch word called gedogen, which is hard to translate, but my unofficial translation of it is technically illegal, but officially tolerated. So, I mean, it's a real thing, and it's what, for example, the coffee shops where marijuana is sold in Dutch cities now. I mean, marijuana is illegal in the Netherlands. But you can, if you stopped a policeman and said, "Where could I get marijuana?" he'd point you to a coffee shop. But it could not be called a marijuana shop because that would be advertising an illegal product. So it's this curious, you know, and if I always say that if you can understand gedogen, then I think you really understand Dutch people. But gedogen goes all the way back, and it explains how it was that they tolerated people, all kinds of different people, Jews coming from, and not only being tolerated, but becoming important businessmen and so on. And filling up the Dutch cities and creating this different, again, a different kind of community from what had existed in much of the rest of Europe. So you put these things together, and you're starting to form a different kind of society. Around 1600, another innovation. Around Europe, people would form companies to do shipping, to get things from other places and bring them and sell them, resell them. And the way you formed a company was a group of people got together, you put in your money, you funded a voyage, the stuff came back, and if there were 8 of you who put the money together, then you divided up into 8 portions, and you each took yours, and that was the end of the company. So a group of Dutch people decided to do this now. They were really feeling their oats, and they wanted to go at the Portuguese and the big Portuguese Empire and the control of the spice trade in the East Indies. And they did one of these. They set up one of these ventures, and it was basically a disaster. They came back years later. Half the people were dead. There'd been mutiny. People were, you know, skeletons, and all they had to show was a few sacks of pepper. But the investors were excited because they realized it could be done. You just had to improve. You had to innovate. You had to keep thinking. And so the one innovation, they had many, but one innovation had lasting effects. The innovation was to make the company permanent. So the next time they get together, and because you have a permanent company, your share of it can be sold to someone else. So the Dutch East India Company became the first company in the world in which shares could be bought and sold and traded. And if you've ever been to Amsterdam, when you step from Central Station is built right where the harbor is. It sort of blocks the city from the harbor. So if you step out of Central Station, you would be coming off the harbor the way people did on ships. And as you're about to enter the rest of the city, there's this kind of windswept, dusty little section of highway. That's actually a bridge called the New Bridge. And that was the world's first stock market, because when people would get off the ships or go onto the ships, they would be trading these pieces of paper. And very quickly they realized that we need a proper building, and they built a stock exchange. So these are, you know, a handful of examples of how this worked and how the Dutch built the golden age. And you start to see the elements, the very modern pieces, building blocks that they created.